Okay, we're continuing with some additional information about the medical anthropology work that you were doing.
Well, the problem is that medical anthropology, I have never really worked as a medical anthropologist. I have always used it as a support of the work that I was doing. Once I had my degree, I was invited to substitute at a undergraduate college in New Jersey, and because their anthropologist had taken a sabbatical, and I taught for 3 semesters, and I went there. This was on the recommendation of my medical anthropology professor that I had before, before I graduated. And so I went, I had an interview, and they asked me to draw up a syllabus, and she helped me, to find books to read for that. And it was called Environmental Health. And environmental health is a part of medical anthropology. And I did that for 3 semesters, and it was a very long trip. First with the subway to New York, then with the bus to a place in New Jersey, and then with a taxi to the college. And it was one way to go, but when I had to go home, it was always a little precarious, because I didn't know if all these things would really work out as they should, but they usually did. But it took almost 3 hours, I think. And they paid me, I don't know, I think $1,000 a semester, something like that. But I liked it, and I discovered when I was beginning to look for a study, I was asked by people, what is your work experience? And when they heard about my volunteering, they laughed. And then I finally found out that what I really learned most of was the Girl Scouts. Because sometimes I had 6 people, sometimes I had 10 people, sometimes I had 2 people. And at our meetings, not the course, at the Girl Scout meeting. And I learned to not look how many I had, and I just do the program. And that's what I always did when I taught, because sometimes they were all there, and sometimes they were not all there. And I really learned from the Girl Scouts how to work with a group of people. And I found for myself that volunteer work is very much underrated. And I learned almost as much from it as from my courses. And then when I finished with the teaching, in the meantime, a friend of mine was doing in Bellevue Hospital she had devised a program of computer exercises to train people who had cognitive defects, like they had brain injury, or they had encephalitis or something like that. And she devised programs that would train certain different parts of the memory, and so I started working with her, and I also applied some of the memory of the work I had done in Bellevue, and I remember that at one time we worked mostly with elderly people, and she kept saying, you have to concentrate on what they can't do. And I found out you have to concentrate on what they can do, because they are already demoralized. And it turned out that months later she taught me, you know, you have to really work on what they can do. Well, anyway, I learned a lot from that, and then when that program fell through because they didn't have money for it anymore, I got, I think, $700 a month or something for that. They were looking in the geriatric clinic for something like that. So I adapted her program to that population, and I worked, I think about at least 6 years.
And this is all at Bellevue?
In Bellevue Hospital. And I also worked with some private patients. And I cannot really say that I was practicing medical anthropology, but I was always using things I had learned from the medical anthropology.
You got that silver tray from one of the patients.
That's all.
Inscribed.
Yeah. So all told, in doing that type of patient work, you worked about 10 years?
Altogether I worked in Bellevue about 12 years.
About 12 years?
Yeah.
And then you stopped about the time that you decided to move here?
Right before we decided to move.
That last winter that you had in New York before moving here was rather severe? It
was, and it really matters. Well, we were already busy moving, but we made sure that it was still going to be the last. Now, there was one other thing that I did, and that was I'm thinking on how to yes, a friend of mine who was a very liberal person, as a matter of fact she was a Marxist, and she was very much against accepting inherited characters, traits, and abilities. And she established a group, and it was the Genes and Gender Conference, and we published books every 2 or 3 years. And I worked with her, and on one occasion I was the editor of one of those books. And I remember that I was doing things that they thought was a little silly. And I was writing about how things were different for women than for men, you know, in life experiences. And eventually we had a kind of disagreement, because they felt that I was, it was at the time when they were talking about preferential treatment for black people, and there was a kind of controversy, and people wanted to do away with it, or at least modify it. And I said that there probably would be modifications, but you know, to take this, that and the other thing in consideration. And we had the group had attracted a few younger people who were very aggressive, and I wrote my paper and they didn't like it, and I wrote it again and they didn't like it, and finally they were going to discuss it, and they didn't tell me what they were going to do, and they told me that they couldn't publish the paper the way it was. And it turned out nobody had read it.
Hmm.
And I said, this is not the way we used to set out. And goodbye.
Mm-hmm.
And Essel is still not over that.
Yeah.
But anyway, so I really cannot call myself a practicing medical anthropologist, or even a practicing anthropologist,
Mm-hmm.
because I've always done something else, but I've always used it.
But in your work with patients, even though it wasn't specifically geared towards different cultural backgrounds, was that something that you always, at some level, were still considering when you would work with them?
Well, basically what I was trying to do was work on something that they could do and try to strengthen that. And
Well, what they could do and their perception of what they could do? Did you have enough of a patient base that you could see there were different cultural differences in that? And differences in the family support that they had as well?
well, when I worked with people at home, yes I did. I worked for several years with an old lady who had a very Irish, Catholic Irish background. And you know, I really got to know a lot about the Irish, and I kind of gave her an opportunity to talk about that. And first of all, it calmed her down, and her daughter asked, I made notes while I was working with people, and she asked me could she have a copy of those notes.
Mm-hmm.
And I always gave her the copies, and she could find out what would calm her mother down. And one thing that was very strong with her was that she had an excellent memory for music. She could sing all the songs that she could think of, with the words and acting. And one thing I really found out is that there's so many forms of memory. And that has been very helpful for
Mhm.
me.
Yeah. So when you moved to Fort Worth in 1997,
Mm-hmm.
and what I think the difference between New York and Texas is a major cultural shift. Again, what were some of the things that you felt that you had to adjust to, and also being from such very different cultural backgrounds, from what you find in Trinity Terrace, which is a retirement community of people who are by and large native Texans, if you experienced any discrimination or things partly on political basis as well.
Well, it was a very interesting experience. In the first place, this place is most patients are women.
Most
They're
of the
very-
residents.
Yeah, the residents, and that's not too surprising because women survive their husbands very often, but also many of the women have worked, which is unusual, and also most of them are pretty comfortable
Financially?
financially. Some are, a little bit on the edge, but they all had enough money to live here. That was one thing. The other thing I found out, that there is such a thing as Southern good manners, and that is very strong in this building. And even though a lot of them have many differences politically with us, they are capable of interacting with us on a personal basis and forgetting about the politics. and that was a very good experience.
Did you have people who immediately wanted to find out what church you were going to?
Now, that was the first question.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, I realized that that was in part because they wanted to help us find the church that would suit us. And they came with suggestions, and they said, you know, there are Jewish synagogues here, and you know, things like that. Now, I must say that the southern good manners go a very long way, and it's very pleasant.
And they are sincere, mostly.
And
Mhm.
then only one other thing, I had hoped to do some of my work here, but I could not do that because, you know, there was no possibility of working with patients at all. But I could do it in an indirect way, and I found that I was, you know, active in some of the committees that they have here, and I found that my background was a help.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you were the head of the health.
Well, yeah, you know, when I was the head of the health committee, I really drew. On,
Yeah. Now, that I think I had always had the impression that the move here was more difficult for you, and I think, and my impression was that one thing that was important to you was being in New York. You had a closer connection to people who were in Holland who would come and visit and talk to you about your work, a closer connection to the scientific community there, and that by moving here there would be people who were less likely to come visit, and yet you've had so many people who have made the trek all the way to Fort Worth to see you and also to understand what would possibly bring you to a place like Fort Worth, which for people from Europe it's the last place that they would think somebody of your intellectual capability would end up.
It was the last place that we thought we would go. You know,
well,
you-
it is not quite true. I think
Well,
there
yeah.
are more things in Holland now that look a little bit like this.
But you haven't mentioned that each time we moved somewhere, it was a place where she swore never to go to.
Mm-hmm.
It was the United States, it was New York, it was Brooklyn, and it was Texas.
And here
Yes,
we
but
are.
Specifically, I said that I will not go to, and there I was.
Yeah, but you actually, and I can hardly say that your move to Fort Worth marked the beginning of your retirement, because you're clearly not truly, neither of you will ever be truly retired, but it marked a transition in your interests. I think, was it when you came here that you became much more involved in your computer program art?
Yeah, and I have always been maybe a little too self-sufficient. I had a friend in camp even who complained that I seemed too self-sufficient. I was not concerned enough. And that was true, that once I have paper and a pencil, I'm okay. I don't notice too much else.
And now once you have a computer, you're okay.
This is even worse. Yeah. Well, I love to write programs.
I think the computer is really has been a tremendous influence on Leo's life.
Well, you taught yourself. Did you take classes in computer programming or language? You taught
Yeah.
yourself all of that.
Yeah, it was, well, this is the language, the true basic I used to make, to have the computer make pictures, has become, yeah, kind of an addiction, I think. And I have a kind of a purist attitude. I want to write programs that I can then tell the computer run it, and I will not touch it. It has to come out perfect the way the computer does it. I'm not going to cheat and draw something in a picture the computer has made. It's none of my business.
Okay, and when you write the programs, does it? Oh, well, tell me a little bit about the chaos theory and how that
Yeah.
interplays with your computer programs for your artwork.
Yeah, actually, two forms of poetry that are named after it. One is called fractal, which is a kind of a pun on the word fractal, invented by Mandelbrot, who thought it gave an image of nature, because in nature all things are made of little things that have the same shape, which is total nonsense. But I switched from there to pure chaos, which is in principle extremely simple. Instead of having an equation like y equals 2x plus 5 with whatever, you can fill in x and you know what y will be. In chaos, so-called nonlinearity, y equals the y it used to be as a function of that. If you would say y equals the sine of y, weird things happen. And I use that often to make the computer disturb itself. It will do a regular pattern until it comes to a value where the chaos begins to act and things happen.
And so when you would write these programs, at least initially, were you surprised at the, because you would include color changes, and were you surprised at the effects, or did you get to a point where you could sort of predict some of the image that would be created?
I predict more and more. I can lie in bed and think of a program, and then next morning I type it out and it runs. But
do you really wait till the next morning?
Not always, no. And the only thing is, if let's say you have you define a value, and you forget, or I forget how I defined it, what happens is instead of putting X somewhere, it puts X in the left bottom corner, and you got all kinds of lines going to the left bottom corner, which tells you, wait a moment, I have a letter missing, or something like that. I like that too.
And your your artwork has really you're doing very. I know you still do a little bit, but very little with any pens, pencils, acrylics, paint. It's mostly with the computer based.
Well, yeah, but I drew 5 illustrations for the book that's coming out in June.
Mm-hmm. And so, and your poetry, the books that are being published, some of them are new collections of existing,
the one that comes out.
And your diaries also. This is something very special.
2 of the diaries came out, and I have one in English lying around, and I'm now switching back to Dutch. I started the Dutch one in Spanish as an exercise, hoping that I would make the same kind of mistakes I did in my first English poetry.
So it would be
so
charming,
fresh.
right?
Yes.
Charming and fresh. Did you? I know some of your earlier works in Dutch were then translated by other people into English. Did you find that a not very satisfying experience?
Not very. I gotta do it myself.
And so
the same for music. A lot of people put music to, especially 1 or 2 poems that everybody always quotes, and that I'm very bored with. And the music is usually not very good, but sometimes pleasant surprises.
Mm-hmm. So, but that was one of the reasons you started to write the same poem in Dutch and English, because you didn't to keep other people from trying to translate it.
Sometimes.
Were there instances where you would write something only in English and then that somebody in Holland would try to translate it into Dutch? that would be an unusual direction to go.
Yeah, I don't think that ever happened.
Yeah, they wouldn't be. I think they would be
They were afraid.
embarrassed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Mom, when did you start? I think it takes tremendous confidence to start writing poetry when you're married to someone who's considered the national poet of Holland. So
Well, what actually happened was, I think, you know, I wrote a little bit of poetry in the past when I was younger, and people looked at it and it not worth it. But then what happened was that somebody asked Daddy to write his memory about somebody that both of us knew, and then Daddy said, well, yes, I'll do that, but Tineke also knew this man. Said, well, let her write too, and so we wrote this kind of biography together, and that gave me some. Two things happened. It gave me more. It was well received, and I wrote it under Tineke Vroman. And then I got more. Let's say I got more confidence in my ability to write something that was literature. And then also this particular book also touched on a problem that we had about this friend. And it turned out that the problem that I thought was dead and buried came back. And all of a sudden I found myself writing poetry that was based on this problem.
is this the name of this person and this problem something you would rather not share, or
No, this is no.
what was, who was it, and what was the problem?
This was it was really rather a funny thing. The evening that I got to know Leo, I also got to know somebody else, and
Which evening was?
his name was Max de Jong,
Mm-hmm.
and Leo, who was a practicing poet and painter, was not talking about it, but he, who was also a practicing poet, actually acted like a practicing poet. And
This Max de Jong did?
yeah. And I was very impressed, because I had literary ambitions, you know, since I was maybe 10, 12 years old. And here was this, you know, actual practicing person. And I didn't think much about it. And then after Leo and I had already had our, you know, strengthening of our relationship and kind of committing for the future.
Your engagement or pre-engagement?
Yeah, whatever.
Because I know you got engaged at different times.
Yes.
Yeah, well, anyway, the final one had already taken place. All of a sudden, I just saw this man. He didn't even see me. And I said, you know, I really would like to get to know him better. And I said to myself, you know, that's a conflict. And so I was thinking about that for a while. And then I finally told Leo, and he went home, and he didn't come back for a few days. And I realized that had not fallen on very happy ears, let's put it that way.
Was that when your
And
mother or your grandmother had told you to go see him?
No,
Or
no.
something?
No,
or
why should they?
because he hadn't been coming around?
I haven't.
Yeah. I thought that at some point...
No, he often came for dinner, but not on a regular basis.
Okay.
But he hadn't come for a couple of days. And I realized that I better go and see him. So I went to him and I explained to him, you know, I was not at all inclined to exchange him for this man. I just wanted to know him better. And then Leo, fortunately, got the point that he was not being pushed aside at all. But it wasn't pleasant for him. It wasn't pleasant for me either.
So you were asked to write. You were asked to write a poem about Max de Young, and then you
No,
prose.
it was
prose.
Yeah.
that
Okay.
was years
Memories.
later.
Yeah, that's I
later.
understand that,
Yeah.
but I'm trying to bring back to this point.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, to make a long story short, Daddy said, why don't you see him? So I saw him, you know, nothing. I mean, he was polite, and that was about it.
You
He
certainly
wasn't
couldn't,
interested in me at
and you
all.
couldn't picture him in his pajamas.
No, I had no, I had no intention to do that. But you know, it was not that kind of thing. It was just somebody who kind of personalized something that I had always admired, like a real poet.
Mm-hmm.
And Leo was a real poet, but he didn't act like one.
But had there not been similar situations at various points in your relationship where, Daddy, you saw a woman who you just thought was interesting, not that you wanted to have any kind of relationship with her, but that you
worse than
wanted to,
Well,
and even after.
explain to her.
We had these meetings in Atlantic City, and I had an assistant, Huilan Cheng. I felt I should see if she attended me sometimes, and I saw her and I realized I was going to fall in love with her, so I told her I couldn't do this and I wouldn't see her again and said goodbye.
What was her reaction?
She didn't say a word.
Yeah, but that was.
She was being Chinese about it.
That was much later, but before you knew me, you had several
Yeah.
women that you
Oh,
were
yeah,
very.
yeah.
But my point was that even as strongly, I'm looking at this in a more global sense for other people to understand in what's obviously a very strong connected relationship, that even when you have people who are as close as the two of you, there's still are other people who are interesting for various reasons, but don't necessarily, you know, you don't have any intention of their interfering with your relationship. It's.
Well, that's why I said goodbye to this assistant. But when I was about 13, I fell in love with a girl I saw sitting on a podium at a high school party, and I never talked with her, but I talked with my classmate who was a friend of mine, and I asked him to inform her about my feelings, I think. But I don't think he did. Anyway, 70 years later, I described this in a diary, and I wrote that she was the daughter of a veterinarian, and both of those people are still alive.
Mm-hmm.
My friend read that and said that was wrong. She was the daughter of some industrial guy, and he went to her and explained to her, and from then on we have had some correspondence, and we actually met her in Rotterdam, and they took a picture of us, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But she was certainly not something I would have married now.
But this invitation to write something about Max de Young was the beginning of your exploring writing a little bit more seriously?
That's right, because as I said, you know, that when I finished this, because I really didn't meet him after the winter of 1940, but I had some correspondence with him because he knew that I was fascinated by him, and he was really decent and nice about it, but he wasn't very interested in it. And frankly, you know, I wasn't interested in starting anything with him. It was a different thing than with Leo. And but after we had written that biography thing, I discovered that I wasn't totally finished with this obsession, which it really was up to a point. And I started writing poetry about that.
And when was this that you?
Oh, 1980, something like that. And then I was like 85, I'm not totally sure when it was. And then, you know, and that was really the beginning of my writing poetry. Now I just wrote something about him, as a matter of fact, but that was another thing.
But so she is writing poetry under her maiden name,
Mm-hmm.
Vroman Sander.
Well, when I started writing poetry, I decided I was not going to use the name Vroman, because first of all, it asks for a comparison,
Mm-hmm.
and usually not a very good one.
Yeah.
And then I really felt that this was something I was doing on my own.
Mm-hmm.
But Tineka's poetry is totally different from mine. I call it a super realist. See, if you read her poems once, they're good. If you read the second time, they're better. If you read the third time, they're wonderful. And these things come to life.
They are the poetry that you both write. It is very complete, very, very different, and I think it would be difficult for anybody to make any kind of comparison.
Well,
I mean, you know, your poetry is very descriptive of deep observations of things that have a strong personal connection, personal meaning for you. And I think that your poetry is no less personal and connected, but the way you express it is more analytical in a way. And it's sort of a combination of impressionistic and analytical and a different imagining in a different way what you're actually seeing. So it's but how did you feel when she started to be published?
Oh, it was wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and getting good reviews.
Yeah, and you're both still writing and publishing, obviously.
And what I think I didn't mention on camera is that we. About 3 years ago, we had a radio interview, and a critic in Holland apparently heard it, and he said, anybody who missed that has missed the most beautiful Dutch ever spoken, and it was her Dutch.
Mm-hmm.
And we figured, well, it's partly because of the colonial life. People, the Dutch in colonies, or the English in Jamaica also speak much more beautiful mother language than.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they're very strict about colloquial, you know, skipping of letters and all that.
Yeah.
That's not tolerated.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I was raised that way.
Yeah. Somebody told me today that she couldn't remember if it was YouTube or something similar to that, but that she found a video of the two of you sitting on what looked like a bed in a hotel room, reading poetry in Dutch, each of you reading your own poems.
Could be.
Yeah,
Does that sound at all familiar?
It's probably Rotterdam, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Well,
Well, she couldn't, because it was Dutch, obviously, she couldn't understand exactly what was going on, but she said she's watched it numerous times just because it's just fascinating, even though the words mean nothing to her. It's just a beautiful interaction between the two of you.
We were just sitting on the bed.
Yeah, as far as I know,
they
yeah.
were rather small rooms usually, and they were quiet. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
and they wanted us next to each other. So,
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to add to cover what we've discussed to this point? About,
I'm trying to keep the institute in mind, which is about immigration mostly, and because you also stressed different aspects, but I don't think we missed anything. I must say I feel equally at home wherever I have been, but never completely.
Mm-hmm.
You too, huh?
well, a little different. I think, you know, when you live here, people, they constantly have relatives coming in, and you know, and they go and visit relatives, and relatives come and visit them, and that is something that you really don't have much
Mhm.
anymore. And in part because you moved, of
Mhm.
course, and you know, we're perfectly happy with you moving,
Yeah.
but it is a different life.
When people here refer to home, I think people in Texas have a very specific definition of what home is. But what is home to you?
I'm going to quote myself. I once wrote a poem about Indian summer, and the last line in Dutch was, heb ik toch liever heimwee dan Holland. And I translated that into, I'd rather be homesick than home. And I heard that got into the Bartlett quotations.
Mm-hmm.
And some people got offended by it, but that's the way it is. That poem was translated into Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in Brooklyn at a time when I got that, and there was a Chinese lady working there, and asked her to translate, and she said, it's about a kind of summer. So it could be Indian summer. Yeah, Indian summer. You sit in front of a house, well, in the Dutch, I sit on the porch, there's a glass of water, I look at the water, and it's as if I'm falling through a hole in my memory when I think of the water that separates me from Holland. So she says, you sit in front of a house and you drink alcohol. I said, no, it's not alcohol, it's water. No, it says alcohol right here. The Chinese people feel, no American is going to sit in front of the house and drink water. Luckily they didn't keep that up, and I didn't think of the alcohol that separates me from Holland.
You sound like some sort of alcoholic, right? But home.
But that is true. I'd rather be homesick than home.
But what is home to you?
Wherever I am, with Tineke.
So home is where you are together.
Where we are together.
And home is
Well, she is
this
home.
home is this apartment in Fort Worth.
No, home,
You know, home is Tineke.
home is sitting next to each other.
Yeah.
So if you're traveling, let's say you were traveling and we're staying in a hotel, and say you want to go back to the hotel, do you say let's go back home?
No, let's
No,
go
we
back
don't.
together.
We don't call it home, but it is home.
So home is just, well, but that's what I was saying, where you are right now is sitting in this apartment,
Well,
and that makes it home because you're here together.
I could add that in dreams, I never dreamt of actual conditions that in the camps. I dreamed sometimes of a camp-like situation and so on. But very often I dream trying to get home to Tineke, and I don't make it.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a nightmare.
Yeah. Well, for many people here, which also surprised me when I moved here, home was where they were from, where their family was from. And there are many times around the holidays, and people would say, "Are you going home for the holidays?" And I would think, "But I'm home. I'm living here now." And I think that's something that I had learned from you, that home is where you are.
Because there's nothing left anywhere that would remind me. I do have a piece of the floor tiles in the Vaardaf of the house where I lived as a child, you know, because the floor was still the same. But I say I'd rather be homesick than home, because home doesn't exist anymore, whichever. Not Indonesia, not Gouda, not Utrecht. It's nice, all of it, but it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Well, with me it's different, I think. I never lived anywhere longer than 2 years when I was a child. And once we were in Holland, you know, we were very well aware that this was a rented place. And it's always been a rented place. This is a rented place to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't feel, well, I like it here, but you know, I don't have real very warm feelings to this place.
But if somebody asks us, where did you live longest in all your life, it is Brooklyn.
Mm-hmm.
And Brooklyn too. Well, there's one thing that we haven't touched on, and I think it is for both of us, but in a different way, that we are becoming very aware of the limited time that we still have. And for me, it is something that there are lots of things I want to do and have to do, not just want to do, and that I'm beginning to believe I won't be able to.
With me, it's almost not the opposite, but my life has been saved, I think, at least 7 times, you could say miraculously. But then I ask myself, well, saved for what? Saved because I still have to do something. I even tell me I'm still writing poetry because I still didn't write the correct poem. It's all exercise.
No, I don't have the feeling that I'm predestined for anything, but I do have the feeling that I should do a couple of things, and I'm not sure that I'll be able to do them.
What are your...
Yes, they're concrete.
And can you tell what they are?
Well, it's the project that I have about writing about the family and things.
Oh yeah.
I'm not sure whether I'll get around to it.
But these interviews are really in
right.
place of doing that in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah.
I think there are some other things that we would like to add to this about specifically your family background.
Well, this is a big help.
Yeah.
But,
well, I wanted to know also, in terms of on a more spiritual level, what your feelings are about life after death, or being together in another world, or what have you talked about that with each other? What are your thoughts about that, or your beliefs about that?
I think we're both agnostics.
yeah.
We both think it's quite possible, and maybe it's not happening. Who knows?
Yeah, I personally, I think there's nothing you can do about it. It happens to everybody, and you don't hear complaints. So I feel that somehow or other people must either be silenced when they die, or they must be content. And I hope that Daddy and I will meet each other, and that it will mean something to us, because you don't know. But well, that's basically my people.
Mm-hmm. And you?
Yeah, well, the previous book of poetry was called Nee, nog niet dood, which is translated No, not dead yet. That sold pretty well. And the one in June will be called Sometimes Everything is Eternal. But that's also my feeling. Sometimes I think, oh,
Well,
like, how can this disappear? How can we disappear? We are so wonderful. But,
I don't think we really totally agree on these things.
I like the theosophy approach where they say you have to keep returning to us until you're perfect. But that would mean that we'll never return again.
No, that's right, and then that's it.
So, and we didn't really talk much about your own family background, theological or religious background in Indonesia, and how that's kind of informed your feelings now about life and death and afterlife.
Krishnamurti, maybe.
Well, basically my parents were theosophists, and theosophy is a religion-oriented, what is considered by themselves a religiously oriented science, and it goes into reincarnation and all kinds of things, and then my parents also had a religion when you go to church, and that was kind of an offshoot of the theosophy, and it was based on Catholicism without all the trappings. There was no celibacy. There were priests and not cardinals and bishops, but there was no confession. There was handing out the little, how do you call it? The little
The communion wafer.
communion. It was communion, and it was really more like the Anglican church, but much more tolerant.
That means that if you're lucky, you return to life as a wafer.
No.
I'm sorry.
Never mind. But anyway, I was raised that way, and until I was about, I think, 15, something like that. And then my mother took us to, well, the Theosophists were expecting a new Messiah, and they had figured out who that was going to be with all kinds of, well, I won't call them hocus pocus, but with their science they had figured out it was a special child in India.
Was it an astrological determination, or
Practically, I think.
It was according to them was science. They figured out somehow it was time for a new Messiah, and they were going to look for one, and they found one. And it was a child, and they practically bought the child and his brother to raise it, in order that he would fit into that role. And
so this was an Indian child that was brought to Indonesia?
Indonesia.
No, America.
Well,
No, stayed in India.
Oh, stayed in India.
Had nothing
Yeah,
well,
yeah.
they bought the child. I didn't know what was done with him
from
after
the
that.
parents.
Okay.
And no, the Theosophy is a worldwide thing.
This is Krishnamurti.
Mm-hmm.
And Krishnamurti, and I forgot his last name. But
George.
anyway, they started preparing him, and they had a camp in Holland, international camp, where we would come and he would preach, and we went there. But what he was preaching was that he had no intention of being a Messiah. He wanted to be a teacher, and he was very much against these fixed religions. And my mother was very much taken by it, and my father didn't protest, but he didn't really follow her in that. And frankly, the more I thought about it, and the more I thought he was right. Why need a God when it is really up to yourself to be what you should be or could be? So it was not too difficult for me to, to accept the fact of, starting with a Jewish person who had more or less the same ideas.
Yeah.
And I consider myself right now like an agnostic.
Mm-hmm.
An agnostic with a conscience and a program,
Mm-hmm.
but not in the need of having a God.
Was your vegetarian background, was that
Well,
part
that
of
was
the
part
theosophy?
Of the theosophist or
Mhm.
vegetarian. It was very India oriented
Mhm.
theosophy.
Yeah.
I think I'm more agnostic than an agnostic. I would like to believe everything until somebody can prove it's not true. Let's say if there are voices in the institute in a certain place that are not explained, I'm immediately ready to believe it's something supernatural until you can prove it isn't. It's much
Mhm.
more fun that way.
Yeah.
Well,
Mhm.
the theosophists basically believed that through incarnations you would grow in the direction of, and the end point was the equivalent of Buddha.
Mhm.
That was the highest point to reach.
And a good side effect I thought of that is that if somebody is nasty, you say to yourself, well, you will have to come back and start all over as a dog, probably.
Mhm.
And you forgive people more easily, I think.
Well, I'm not thinking along those lines. Well, I don't consider myself a theosophist because there were a lot of crazy things among the theosophists. And anyway, they were so angry at that poor Krishnamurti.
Mhm.
That
For
all you have
denying
to-
his messiahhood.
Well,
Yeah.
they were the chosen people, of
Yeah.
course, themselves. You only have to mention his name and you see red.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else you want to add to this?
Not at the moment.
I could add that I have been using the name system. I wrote, somebody asked me to rewrite a psalm, and it was, he picked one that asked God to destroy my enemy and all that sort of stuff. So I felt it pretty disgusting. I asked if I could write my own, and he said yes, and I think I wrote about 100 psalms in Dutch and English.
Mm-hmm.
But I use the word system because I want to, I have the feeling that it all hangs together somehow, but I don't know how, and system was the only word I could think of that people haven't thought about yet.
And when you say system, it's in lieu of using the word God,
Yes.
or
Yes,
but
definitely.
it's whatever, it's what you're comfortable with in terms of that
Yeah.
that presence that's bigger than you are.
Yeah.
And that's the whole system of, well, not, I guess some people might think of it as the universe or the solar system or whatever it is.
They may call it pantheism or whatever.
Mhm.
Well,
Okay.
I'm not even going that far.
No.
But I think personally, really, what my problem is, I feel that I'm losing certain faculties. I'm losing part of my memory, and things like that. And I feel that I'm in a contest of maintaining what I want to do.
Sort of a race to
Yeah,
to.
well, not being sure that I will be able to do what I really would like to do.
Yeah. Well, shall we wrap it up?
Yeah.
And
Okay.
okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Goodbye.